I get asked a lot about dreadlocks, right? Because if I'm supposed to be a Ras Tafari, then I should have dreadlocks. So a lot of people say, when am I gonna grow my dreads? As if growing dreadlocks is the definition of Rastafari. But that's false. That is totally false. Even the founders of the Rastafari movement down in Jamaica, Leonard Howard, did not have dreads. Many of those early founders of the movement who went to see His Majesty did not have dreads, as well as the biggest facet of it all is that Haile Selassie I did not have dreadlocks, and His Majesty did not say that we need to grow dreadlocks. There are many people who are of Rasta, true Rasta, who do not have dreads. And the thing about it is that anyone's faith, no matter what the faith is, your faith cannot be justified by your hairstyle. So the question should not be, when am I going to grow my dreads? The real question should be, am I being true to His Majesty's word? If you want to advocate a hairstyle, then why not just advocate the afro? Because that was Haile Selassie's hairstyle. As well as during the 60s and the 70s, the afro, that was popular because of Haile Selassie. The whole world was emulating Haile Selassie with the afro. So if you want to follow a hairstyle, then why not follow his hairstyle and bring the afro back, right? But even if you bring the afro back, that's vain, right? Because what's that going to do? It's not your hairstyle that's going to save the world, right? But, you know, if you want to follow Haile Selassie, then go ahead and follow his hairstyle and grow an afro. Even in Ethiopia, when His Majesty was overthrown in 1974, they cut the hair of His Majesty's ministers. They cut off the afro. His ministers couldn't wear their afro, right? Because they knew, the Derg knew that afro symbolized Haile Selassie. So if you want a hairstyle, then why not take His Majesty's hairstyle and grow an afro? As well as smoking weed. Now, what does smoking weed have to do with Rastafari? Haile Selassie did not smoke weed, right? So this is something that was the culture was created by men to suit their own purposes. So there were certain people who liked to smoke weed, and they just incorporated this into Rastafari, even though Haile Selassie never said anything about smoking weed. And there's a fable that goes around the Rastafari movement about cannabis growing on King Solomon's grave, which is completely false. So they say that you know, weed, they say weed, it grows from the earth, therefore, you know, it's a pure thing, it's a holy thing, it's of God because it comes from the earth. But the reality is that everything comes from the earth. You know, every chemical, every drug, every substance comes from the earth. What does not come from the earth? People are not going into Mars and bringing chemicals back. Everything comes from the earth. Weed comes from the earth. Coke comes from the earth. So now, since weed comes from the earth, you know, if that's the logic, then we should also be taking coke, because that comes from the earth. Everything comes from the earth. You know, where do you think things come from? Everything comes from the earth. So that argument that, you know, marijuana comes from the earth, therefore, you know, it's from God, is completely ridiculous, because everything comes from the earth. Where do you think things come from? They're not going to Mars and bringing stuff back. It doesn't come from, you know, another planet or another galaxy. Where do you think everything comes from? Everything comes from the earth. Now, we need to be true to His Majesty, because Haile Selassie did not say anything about growing hair. Growing your hair and growing your locks has nothing to do with Rastafari. Haile Selassie did not say anything about smoking weed. Okay, His Majesty did not smoke weed. He lived a very healthy lifestyle. He exercised, he ate properly, you know, he lived a long life, right? And we have to follow his example if we want to live a long and healthy life, because a lot of people who follow this unhealthy lifestyle of taking, you know, these drugs, because marijuana is a drug, and I don't mean that in a negative sense, because drugs are Drugs are things that you take if you're sick, right? You take this drug, and marijuana could cure you, right, for certain diseases if you're suffering from that. But if you're not suffering from anything, then there's no reason for you to take this medicine, because all you're doing now is you're harming yourself. Okay, so we need to look at this logically. There's no reason for anyone of Rastafari to try to say that someone needs to grow their hair, that someone needs to grow their locks. You don't need to ask me about growing my locks. As well as we need to stop smoking. We need to stop smoking weed, and we need to actually follow Haile Selassie for real now. The Old and the New Testament means the ending of old ways, the end of an old interpretation, and the adoption of a better, more accurate, and truthful interpretation. And the Old Testament and the New Testament, that symbolizes the difference between man-made ways, a man-made philosophy and culture, and the true revelation from God. Right? So the Old and the New Testament, when you read it in the Bible, it's all the same word, because Christ said that he will fulfill everything written in the law, right, and the prophets. So he did not come to do away with Moses' law, which is why he said, if you believe Moses, then you will believe in me, right? You will believe Christ. So there is actually in the letter no difference between the Old and the New Testament. The difference comes in how it is adopted and how it is, enforced, and how people are following this word. And we see that again within Rastafari. You see, the word from His Majesty and the example from His Majesty has always been the same from 1930 up until now. Haile Selassie, was a very popular statesman. He's in front of your face. He gives speeches. You see him, you see how he dresses. You see how he looks. The word has always been the same, but how you follow him must change, right? Because the way that people are following and the way that people are interpreting Haile Selassie and the way that they're interpreting Rastafari must change, right? And this change really does not have anything to do with hair or weed, because all of that is superficial, right? Because me telling you don't grow your dreads or to grow your hair means nothing. It has nothing to do with your character. It won't save the world. A bunch of people with a certain hairstyle is not gonna save the world. A bunch of people who are taking drugs is not gonna save the world, right? What is gonna save the world, and what the New Testament means, is for us to be true to the word of Haile Selassie, to adopt his principles. We must emulate his principles, right? We must emulate, the things that he stood for, what he advocated, his mission. We must follow that mission, which is going to be, to gain some political power, to be effective in raising the standards of people's living conditions, right? To help the poor, to do all of the things that His Majesty was working towards, to unify the people, to reform, for us to step out of the Stone Ages when it comes to certain ways and backwards customs that we are following, and to adopt better principles. So that's the difference between the Old and the New Testament. The New Testament, which is what we must learn. The New Testament is actually the same word, but now we're being true to it. So we must learn about Haile Selassie, and now we must be true to the things that he did, to the things that he said. And if you really if you really want to be vain in your vanity, then be true to how he looks and how he dresses as well. We owe it to His Majesty to follow him, because Haile Selassie is the reason why imperialism and colonialism has ended. He is the one who stopped that, okay? He is the one who was at the forefront of the liberation of the African continent. He was at the forefront of the civil rights movement. And this affected not only Africa, but it affected all people. The threat against the League of Nations, if collective security would have broken down, this led to not only, them trying to take Ethiopia, but it led to Europe almost being destroyed as well. His Majesty is the one who saved Europe, because it's these principles that must be adapted, or else everyone is going to suffer. And it's something that the League of Nations found out the hard way, and it's something that we must learn from, so that we do not repeat the same mistakes of the past. Okay, so we owe it to His Majesty. He's the savior of the world. When people say God is the savior of the world, you know, they pretty much are just saying that rhetorically. But Haile Selassie actually saved the world. That is an historical fact. He saved the world. He saved Europe. He saved Africa. He saved Asia, you right, from the Japanese threat with Tojo in during World War II. All of this would have led to the destruction of humankind. Not to mention even after World War II, during the Cold War threat, His Majesty was part of the non-aligned bloc, and he was basically trying to get this Cold War between the USSR and the USA. He was trying to get them to stop, and he was saying that this arms race is a complete waste of money, that we can be using this money for more effective means, such as curing poverty, education, and raising the people's standard of living. If we choose to adopt his principles, this will save the world. So Haile Selassie is the savior according to real terms, and we owe it to him to actually follow him in spirit and in truth, if we want to make a difference in the world and in our lives as well.